Welcome to the Apocalyptic Supperclub, where I plate up stories to feed the heart and mind and nourish our capacity to meet this very challenging moment of being alive in a drastically changing world. All the way back in 1963, Pat Haggerty, a co-founder of the seminal tech company Texas Instruments, said, "It's a tremendously stimulating thing for each person who has learned that a small group of individuals can change the world if they really want to." And it's the "if they really want to" part that is critical, which really begs the question, how do we awaken a desire for our own heroism? Stress and anxiety about the brokenness of our political system clouds the American psyche. If you take your own poll by asking those around you, I am sure you will conclude that the majority of Americans feel a sense of powerlessness and uncertainty in the face of our growing democratic crises. But most of that helplessness is pure perception. It's just in our heads. There is always so much we can do. It's just a matter of tracking it down and then plugging in. And our show today highlights the truth that a small group of individuals can change the world, and you can become one of them. Swing Left and its nonpartisan affiliate, Vote Forward, have had an outsized influence on elections since its founding in 2017 by a small group of concerned individuals who had never worked in politics before, but they were disturbed with the election of Donald Trump and MAGA's assault on democratic values. Their strategy of targeting elections in swing districts has paid off, and they are now at the dawn of a powerful new revolution that should excite your citizen heart. Over the next hour, we're going to learn the history of Swing Left and peer into its visionary future, which is called Ground Truth. And there is no one better to take us on this journey than Swing Left's Executive Director, Yasmin Radjy.
My name is Yasmin Radjy, originally from the Bay Area, currently living in Washington, D.C. I'm the executive director of Swing Left and also of our nonpartisan affiliate, Vote Forward. Swing Left was founded by some folks who had not worked in politics before in 2017. We actually launched the eve of Donald Trump's first inauguration. And the founding vision was a very simple one, which is that so many of us living across the country want to make a difference. We care a lot about our politics, whether we work in it full time or think about it every once in a while. And we're not sure where we can maximize our impact. And so our founder himself lived out in Western Massachusetts. And when Trump was elected, he knew he wanted to do something. He knew that the House was going to really matter as a winnable first target to shift the balance of power. But he lived in a really blue pocket of the country. And he wanted to figure out, well, where's the closest swing district to me? It was a simple question, to which the answer was way more complicated. He would spend hours looking up Cook Political Report ratings and this and that and the other. And it took him hours and hours to figure out where the closest swing district was to him. And then it was a whole other process to figure out, well, who's running in the primary? Who's viable in the primary? Does my money actually help this race or not? And so what he started with some friends was a website where people from anywhere in the country could type in their zip code. It was called Swing District Finder. And upon typing in their zip code, they would get connected to the most competitive swing house district near them. And they would be nudged toward either where to donate or where to take action, with information also on, if you're donating, where is that going? And from the very beginning of Swing Left, his initial hope was, I want to make a difference in winning against the Republican, not sort of putting my thumb on the scale of primary politics. So from the very beginning, Swing Left started to innovate. So many people wanted to help, but weren't sure, well, does it help to put a yard sign up? Does it help to go stand on a street corner with a sign? Does knocking on doors help at all? And so very early on, Swing Left was not just about in one click, here you can take an action, but informing people of, here's why we're telling you to go out and knock on doors, or here's why we're telling you to make calls, and here's the research that that's based off of. So that's the long answer to the kind of founding vision. And what we saw that I think is really relevant to this very different political moment that rhymes in many ways with 2017 is that that was a gap that was much larger than our founding team imagined. And so many people wanted to make a difference and never really felt like they were given that on-ramp to that opportunity, particularly in places like where you and I are both sitting in really blue pockets of the country. And so, fast forward Swing Left in the 2018 cycle, our very first election cycle, was the largest driver of volunteers on the hard side, meaning directly to campaign offices for competitive House races across the country, and moved millions of dollars to races across the country. And today, we continue having that very simple mission of how do people move their dollars and or their time to the most competitive races to win the balance of power. But in the election cycle since 2018, the balance of power has been about more than just the House. And so we also work on Senate races, governor, state legislative races, occasionally some state Supreme Court races. And so we continue to be rooted on giving people the information they need to make a difference that will actually move the needle on winning back power.
Yasmin, what I love about what you just shared is hearing about this evolution, and it points to the fact that when people just start somewhere and they infuse what they do with intelligence and compassion, it evolves. People get excited about what you're doing and they join in. And then here you are, like you said, the largest driver of direct volunteer action in elections today. It's terribly exciting and provides people who live in very, very blue areas a way to engage effectively and know they are making a difference. In fact, our local group, which is very strong, sent out a message saying that in the November 2025 election, every candidate that Swing Left backed won. Is that true?
That is true. We can send you the receipts. We are very proud of that. But the reason it's really important that we won every single race is because we only targeted the most competitive ones. So we didn't target any races that were like, obviously a Democrat was going to win, and that sort of like ups our score. Every race was really, really competitive in really purple turf in really different parts of the country. And an anecdote of where the source of my real inspiration is we had a group of volunteers. I spent the last weekend of the election out in Virginia, in Newport News, Virginia, which was the part of the state which that week before the election had the biggest drop off in terms of voters who had voted Democratically in 2024, who had not yet voted and didn't seem to have any intention of voting. So Virginia Democrats were really freaked out of how are we going to win? We'll probably win the governor's race. How are we going to win these critical down ballot races without Newport News showing up? Newport News is very far from DC, so a lot of our volunteers there couldn't come. We don't have a big volunteer base there. But a group of students in New York City, I think it was about 55 of them, they said, wherever needs our help the most, we want to knock on doors for 4 days straight. Whatever needs the most help, put us to work. And these are, like they're 18 to 21-year-old students. I go down, I meet with them, and we go to knock on doors for the Attorney General race. There was a big scandal with the Attorney General who sent some incredibly stupid text messages, ones that are indefensible. And so he was in hot water and it looked like he was going to lose. But we need a Democratic Attorney General in Trump's America to be able to protect the state and both get things done with Democratic power, but also block Trump from really, really, really bad stuff. So these students come in, we knock on doors together, and I asked one of them, is this your first time taking action? And she said, no, I've been really, really involved in the Mamdani campaign. I've been going every day after class. I knock on doors, etc. I'm really, really proud. And I said, well, Mamdani is incredibly progressive, right? This is a candidate who's pretty centrist, and this is a part of the state where we're having some pretty tough conversations with voters who really don't have any intention of voting Democratic. I said, what made you want to come down all the way to Newport News rather than stick around and be a part of a big Mamdani win in New York? And she said, well, you told us this was the best place to win back Democratic power. I don't care if I don't agree with the voters or not. I want to spend my time as strategically as possible. And it was conversation after conversation I had with these students was the same way of just a incredible thoughtfulness about the moment that we're in, that it doesn't matter. We don't have to fall in love with every candidate. We need candidates to get us to where we need to go, and we have to win power. And so I say that of the races that we won with our 100% win record in 2025, it was hard-fought wins, and the way that we won those races and the people who powered those races are endlessly inspiring. So many stories of people who are laser focused on let's win power, and then we'll focus on our internal fights as a party of should we move to more to the left, more to the center, more to the sideways? Let's worry about that later because right now we've just got to get power.
So, Yasmin, the reason I reached out to Swing Left is I had the great privilege of jumping onto an introductory event about your visionary new initiative called Ground Truth. I was so excited about what I heard. I knew I had to bring you onto the show. So let's talk about this next evolution of Swing Left. Again, it's called Ground Truth, and it's a profound transformation in the art of canvassing, a total overhaul. So could you give us a little background into why, how you canvass needed to change and what makes this new evolution possible?
Yeah. So many people have talent, skills, time, dollars at whatever level, and there's no on-ramps for them to make a difference. So our motto has always been easy on-ramps and no ceilings. People should be able to do as much as they want to with their time and their talent and their treasure, but they need that on-ramp, and that's our job. And one of the challenges that we've had is we can provide that on-ramp, but then we are funneling people to campaigns that range in their efficacy, that range in their level of infrastructure. And so in the best case scenarios, there's campaigns that are incredibly well run, that really, really believe in the power of grassroots. And so when we send hundreds and hundreds of volunteers to go out and knock on doors in one of those competitive races, we are handing them off to an office that is using them as strategically as possible. Now, that's not always the case everywhere. Sometimes those races are, for a spectrum of reasons, not actually using that grassroots firepower in the most strategic ways. And so what we've seen as a trend line in a lot of places is the campaign ends up not really having the ability or the infrastructure to talk to voters until really late in the election cycle, meaning oftentimes just in the final month of an election is when folks are talking to voters for the very first time. Many of the conversations that are being had with those voters are really transactional conversations, and then just sort of checking a box of what that voter might care about. And those conversations, because they're so transactional, are often really short. We talk to people for, I don't know, a few seconds, maybe a minute, and then we move to the next door and we all report out on, we knocked on so many doors. Well, knocking on doors is not talking to a person, right? And so much of what the sort of original vision for bringing in grassroots power to organize, to turn out voters, to persuade voters was rooted in some really, really good research and some best practices. And the implementation of that has been kind of all over the map. And so for us, we've been somewhat handcuffed in that sometimes the campaign is really well run, sometimes it's not. From our perspective, both of those campaigns need the support because the math is the math about the balance of power. And even if a campaign is not well run, we still need it to win a House majority. And just to sort of ground us in just how narrow our House majority is today, we lost the House majority in the 2024 election cycle by 7,309 votes. It's nothing. It's a rounding error. So we can't just disregard races because we don't like how they're run. And I think the other layer here is most of the time, in fact, it's not that there's a bad intention. It's that even the campaigns that want to invest in grassroots will say to us, listen, all the incentives in the ecosystem are for me to go out and spend all my time fundraising. I want to build a field office. I don't have the budget to hire a field director, meaning a person who can bring in all that grassroots power. So I have all these volunteers who are banging on my door. I want to tell them what to do, and I don't have a thing to get them to go do. These are not new problems. These are not 2024 problems. These are problems that are asymmetric across the country. We are really proud of the work we've done at Swing Left. We've raised $140 million in grassroots contributions directly to Democratic campaigns and state parties. We've talked to 50 million voters in a combination of doors, phones, and letters. So we're proud of that. And it doesn't matter if we're proud of it if we lost, right? So what can we do differently? And one of the things that we started to think a lot about was, well, what would it look like if we could actually talk to voters much earlier? What would it look like if those conversations were deep and meaningful conversations rather than checking a box and keeping it moving to the next door? And what would it look like if we built campaigns that were centered on all of the people who want to pitch in and make a difference rather than grassroots being an afterthought? And we had really clear vision for what that could all look like, but we really believe in building infrastructure that will strengthen the Democratic Party, not duplicate sort of a parallel party entity. And what really unlocked our imagination for being able to actually jump head first into the deep end of trying something really new is that there was a change in campaign finance rules, a really wonky change with huge implications, which basically changes the rules of how canvassing can function. Meaning, we as an outside organization can build the infrastructure of what we call deep canvassing, setting things up to go out and incentivize volunteers to go talk to people for 10 minutes rather than 30 seconds, to be able to have, when we have a really rich conversation with a voter, not just distill 15 minutes of sometimes pretty emotional back and forth with the voter about what they're going through in their lives, their economic lives, their community, et cetera, into a checkbox of this person cares about affordability, but to be able to capture all the rich texture of that person just lost their job and they're pregnant and are really worried about what affording diapers can look like when there's no living wage jobs in their community. All of that, what would it look like if we could not just collect that rich information, but share it back directly to the candidate, directly to the state party, directly to all the partners that are working together with those folks? First of all, so that the power of what grassroots are hearing on the ground is at the center of what the campaign is hearing. They're not just hearing polling information, they're also hearing that sort of what we call social listening. But also, what would it look like if that information was then used to not just disregard wide swaths of the electorate that are hard to bring onto our side, that we have some real work to do, but that we spend the next year really trying to bring those folks onto our side in an authentic and real way. We started our pilots last September in congressional districts around the country. I'd say the headline is we found that our hypothesis that starting early, having curious, authentic conversations with voters and collecting rich data and building new tech to be able to capture that data is off to a really amazing start.
You are listening to the Apocalyptic Supperclub, where I whet the appetite for the politically possible through telling stories of regular people who step up to create real change. My guest is Yasmin Radjy, Executive Director of the election advocacy organization Swing Left. Coming up next, Yasmin describes just how much one person can make a difference through engaging Swing Left's key strategies. Yasmin, so many of the people that I speak to express deep doubt that anything they do can make a real difference. But when I hear that the balance of power in the House was decided by a little over 7,000 votes, I mean, this is like across the nation, it would seem like there is political leverage there that is well within the reach of each of our efforts. Can you please speak to that?
The lack of agency that people are feeling right now is by design, right? And it also is so much more extreme than it was in 2018, because I think we all collectively thought that the first Trump election was aberrant. And so many people stepped up thinking, okay, if I just do my part, we can get back on the sort of long arc of history that is bent towards justice. And this was just a blip on the radar. And I think the fact that we are seeing things be so much worse this time around, and that we did so much and we did not beat Trump. And then we're seeing the scale of what ICE is doing and the scale of what is happening around the world in this sort of insane administration. It makes people feel like, well, who am I as a person who, works full time, has kids, is not a political expert? Who am I to make a difference? And I think that is, again, by design, because when everybody thinks that way, then we don't collectively take the levels of action that we need to take in order to put ourselves back on the right course. But the two most competitive House races that we won were both in California. Adam Gray up in the Central Valley, just about 90 minutes outside of the Bay Area. He won, I think it was just under 200 votes. I mean, just the tiniest margin. And then down in Southern California, Congressman Derek Tran, he won by just over 600 votes. And so I think, to your point, it's not sort of a feel-good talking point that each one of us can make a difference. One volunteer could be responsible for that entire margin.
Wow, one volunteer could be responsible for that entire margin. That's really something to reflect on. In fact, a political historian recently put a laser focus on the tiny number of people who could step in and shift us out of this rising authoritarian nightmare. It would take a total of 23 people in Congress to impeach the louts in office and get them out of office. 23 Republicans between the House and the Senate, and we'd be done. So folks, if you think you don't matter, think again. One volunteer could help change this equation. Yasmin, I'm hoping that people are really waking up to the joyful possibility of actually being the drivers of democracy through rolling up our sleeves and investing our resources. And that can be our time or our money or both, whatever each of us can do.
That's exactly right. One of the things that one of our candidates said to me last cycle was, when I get a bunch of grassroots contributions through Swing Left, grassroots contributions that I didn't have to fly across the country to do an event for, that I didn't have to spend hours and hours on call time getting small contributions one after the other. He said, what that gives me is the gift of time back in my district, so I can actually go and talk to voters, listen to voters, spend more time with them. So I think it is both sides of it. I think sometimes when we talk about both the opportunity, but also the obligation that each of us has to act as fully as we can as citizens, whatever that means. The definition for each of us is different. Sometimes we're like, well, does that put politicians off the hook? Does that take them off the hook? And the answer is no. For the folks who are donating in small dollars to candidates, what that allows us to do is to push our candidates to spend more time in their districts. When we go out and talk to voters, using that citizen-funded effort to go out and talk face-to-face, deeply, authentically with folks of different political persuasions and give that information back, we are rooting campaigns more in the voters who are too often left behind because they don't have an organized interest group fighting for them the way that a lobbyist does, right? And so all of it matters. And so I think for some folks, they have more of a financial budget, some have more of a time budget. Most of us have some mix, some blend, even if it's a little asymmetric. And as we're having this conversation, I hope folks think about sort of what are the contributions that they are uniquely able to provide. And we have an open door to all of it.
Right. So for folks who feel exhausted trying to figure out where to direct their efforts, clearly Swing Left is both strategic and effective. You are also visionary. I remember listening to an interview with Swing Left all the way back in 2021, and your then director was talking about your 10-year plan. I was impressed by that. A lot of people at that time in 2021 were in deep denial that we were still under threat from Trump. He had been voted out, and we so wanted it to all be over. And 2021 feels like a decade ago. It's shocking. But back then, I'm sure you couldn't even conceive of where you are today, which is what inspired this interview. So let's pivot back to ground truth, which is really the hot news in Swing Left right now. In the event I attended, I was blown away by the announcement that volunteer canvassers would be talking to voters far in advance of elections, and now they would not just be ringing the doorbells of Democrats, but they'd be speaking to all voters. That seemed to have some sweeping implications.
Yeah, it's huge. We have gotten so good at the most micro targeting. We have more data than we ever have before, and that is a gift that we need to use. And I think the flip side of that is it has made us think that we know much more than we do. And so what I mean by that is what we collectively as a Democratic Party know how to do really well, what we have gotten down to as science, is if someone is already convinced that they want to vote for a Democrat, they're not necessarily going to remember to vote, or they may not have the full motivation to get out there. We have gotten down to the science, what's called social pressure mobilization, of convincing them through social pressure in that final stretch to get out and vote. We know how to script it. We know how to use mail. We know how to talk to them on the doors. We know all of that. And that is not that big of a group of people, right? And so I think the big areas of unknowns where we actually have lots of conflicting research is everybody else, which means the Republican and independent voters that we need to persuade not to totally change their entire ideology, but to vote for the Democrat this year for the House and hopefully for years to come. And what we also know very little about is the population of people who used to identify as hardcore Dems, but so many Democratic voters are saying, what do Democrats stand for besides being anti-Trump? And we've seen the charts from the various articles that we've read post-election of demographic groups that used to be staunchly Democratic are moving away from us every single year. And we still treat them as social pressure mobilization targets, meaning we assume that they're already convinced that they should vote Democratic, and we just need to nudge them gently to pressure them to go out and vote, rather than we actually have to persuade them that voting for the Democratic Party is something that is relevant to their lives, relevant to their values, and explain what that will actually accomplish, right? And so those two buckets of persuadable voters who are not Democrats, voters who are shaky Democrats or are moving away from us, that we need to both persuade and mobilize. That is a huge swath of the electorate. We, again, have very conflicting research on what to do about those folks. What happens on campaigns is we make a couple of big assumptions, which is we're not going to have very many volunteers until the final couple of weeks of the election, and we're not going to be able to talk to enough people. So let's just ignore most of those persuasion targets and most of those shaky Democrats because we don't have time to talk to them. Let's just talk to our base, meaning we are completely ignoring a wide swath of the electorate. What our premise is at Ground Truth is we can't afford to do that anymore. First of all, we have way too many assumptions baked in on who the likely Democrats are. And second of all, these are races that come down to the margins. We cannot afford to just ignore the tough conversations. And so rather than pretend like we have it all figured out and we know exactly how to motivate these folks and we know exactly who they are and how they're changing over time, let's go out and knock every door, not just the ones of the hardcore likely Dems, and listen to folks. And so rather than entirely base our assumptions off of demographics, when demographics are increasingly shakier stand-ins for how folks vote, go out and talk to everybody. And the way that we open up our conversations is with curiosity. And so we introduce ourselves as I'm a volunteer with Ground Truth, which is a program to help the Democratic Party do a better job of listening. And the question that we ask is, how are you feeling about the direction of our country? The purpose of that question is not that it's some sort of like magical question, but it's that every person has something to say about that. Unfortunately, most of us do not have positive things to say in response to that question, given everything that's going on. But someone recently told me that I thought was so helpful is some of the ways that we as Democrats open a conversation is with such a hyper political technical question that the other party get on defense, and people who are not that political don't want to engage in that conversation. How do you feel about the direction of our country? Everybody wants to engage. And what our volunteers do as that person starts to answer is they're not trying to gotcha, they're not trying to debate, they're not trying to sort of figure out a way to just squirrel in some talking points. They are focused on asking curious questions, being authentic, so not sort of just reading canned talking points, and being non-judgmental. And I think that's really, really important. The way to win elections is not to lecture. It is first and foremost to listen and to actually hear what the other person is saying and engage with it. And so what that means is our volunteers are aiming to have a 10, 15-minute conversation with someone. They are repeating back what they are hearing. They're not hiding that they're a Democrat. They're also not hiding if they disagree, but they're having a real human conversation. And I think, candidly, that is a muscle that has atrophied in our society, certainly from our politics, but even just like the way that we engage with each other at Thanksgiving dinner, et cetera, et cetera. Like we've got to relearn this skill.
We do need to relearn this skill. And also, what jumps out at me as you describe a program of helping the Democrats get better at listening is first, hallelujah, and then what a diametrically opposite way of trying to reach people right now, which is often blaring overcooked ads or the vicious debating and name-calling that has become commonplace in our politics. So, good news, you mentioned that your early efforts are showing some really good results. What are those?
The data that we got back in our pilot, which was 25 canvases across 14 competitive districts across the country, was that 1 in 4 of the Republicans that we talked to were very open to voting for a Democrat. We're not going to get all of them to our side, but if 1 in 4 of the people that we literally would not even be talking to are open, then of course we should be investing more time in them. And we can't just now ignore them all the way until election day. It means that we've got to take what we learn from that conversation and follow up, which is both important so that they're getting the information that they need, so that they're hearing follow up about specific things, but also because so much of demonstrating a different way of doing politics is listening up front and then showing that you actually listened by following up in the ways that that person talked about.
Yes, there is a nuclear force that gets released when we listen to people and then circle around and follow up. In fact, you were interviewed in Politico's Score, and there was a specific quote from the pilot study that you did up in Oregon. And the gist of it was that by getting this information and feeding it back to the campaigns, it supercharged the organizing structure. Can you tell me, what does this mean exactly?
My very first campaign was on the 2008 Obama campaign in rural Ohio. I grew up in the Bay Area. I went to college in Philly. Rural Ohio I was like as outsider as they come. And something that really reshaped my politics was going out, knocking on doors, hearing someone say some of the most openly racist stuff I had ever heard in my life. I mean, I heard people use the N-word casually, regularly. It was outside of my imagination in a like very depressing way. But in those conversations, someone would say something really offensive, period, new paragraph, but I'll vote for Barack Obama. What that sort of like radically changed in my imagination, where I was in 2008, we won for Barack Obama by 2 percentage points. We just barely eked by. It was really tough turf. And today, that is a part of the country that is plus 28 points for Trump, right? These are the same voters. There was no big demographic shift. It is the same people I was talking to them, voted for Barack Obama now, staunchly support Donald Trump. And I say that because so much of, I think, our politics has moved away from a culture of persuasion. Is if I had in those conversations said, screw you, you racist, you can go fly a kite, or, put more strongly, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to elect Barack Obama, right? And I think there is work of like, I hope that we can do the work to get underneath people's racist sentiments and transform them over time. But in order to win, we also need to meet, I hate the expression meet people where they are, but sort of engage with reality, which is some people are not aligned with us on everything. They could be aligned with us on something. So how does all of this supercharge organizing efforts? Something I learned as we were building the Ground Truth program that I didn't know, that I was really surprised at, despite having worked in politics for a long time, is my assumption going into the starting of Ground Truth was that every House campaign that we were working with had a few tools in their toolkit to understand their voters. One of which is the time you spend in the district. You're out there talking to people, whether at town halls or community events or whatever. The second is polls, and the third is focus groups. Most House campaigns don't even have the resources to do focus groups. Even the best funded campaigns, maybe they do a focus group late. And maybe if they do it, they're just talking to a few people on Zoom. So most of the texture that a campaign is getting about how people are feeling about the affordability issue, that they're getting a pullback, that of course affordability issues are really high, most of the texture they're getting is anecdotal. And if they're spending very little time in their districts, and they're probably spending more time with the best organized people, business leaders, labor unions, and other groups, they're getting a slice of what's happening, but they're not getting a sense of what the average voter cares about in this sort of like texture and nuance. What we mean by we can supercharge what a campaign can do is we are providing the campaign with the texture that they want, that they need, for everything from the kinds of speeches that they're giving in their district to be able to point to the kinds of affordability issues coming up in their district in real time. This is what I'm hearing from voters. It also allows, as they are communicating online, as they are communicating by mail, to add that texture as well. And I think you have every once in a while aberrantly amazing, high EQ, sort of like once in a generation candidate like a Barack Obama who sort of instinctually knows a lot of this stuff. Most candidates, this is not a knock on them. They want to have that texture. They don't necessarily automatically have it. And so for us to be able to make sure that Democrats are rooted in what people care about, how they talk about those things, and what vision they have for our country moving forward, we need to help them with that texture.
This texture Yasmin describes is critical. Without understanding people and their actual concerns, it's hard to offer them democratic choices they can believe in. But when we genuinely seek to hear, to understand, and to connect, it creates openings through which new perspectives can enter and perhaps defeat the current roar of propaganda shutting us off from one another and silencing truths well worth considering. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll hear from some of the canvassers who actually went out into the streets with Ground Truth's pilot program. This is the Apocalyptic Supperclub, where I serve up stories to nourish belief in political possibility and to help you understand how much you matter. In this interview with Yasmin Radjy of Swing Left, we are digging into their brilliant new canvassing program called Ground Truth that starts long before elections take place, knocks on every door, and seeks to listen authentically to rebuild trust and win elections. Yasmin Radjy has told us the facts of this new program, but it is when we hear real people sharing their own experiences that offers us a chance to see ourselves in a story. So I want to share with you a couple of first-person accounts of Ground Truth's canvassing experience. We start with Mitzi from the California pilot study, and then we'll roll into Zach, who worked with a group of college-aged canvassers in upstate New York. This recording is from Ground Truth's public online presentation.
I'm Mitzi, and I was a Ground Truth canvasser in California's 45th congressional district in Southern California. And I have to say that Ground Truth was honestly a completely different experience from any other canvassing I've done. What I loved most about it is how it literally pushed me out of my safety bubble. And by that, I mean, instead of only knocking on what would be considered a likely Democratic door, we knocked on every single door on the blocks that we canvassed on. And so what that meant is that I had conversations with really wide ranges of people in California District 45, people that I would have otherwise never have met on a canvass. And because the script is truly built around actively listening and having open-ended questions, the conversations felt so much more genuine and human. I actually talked to more people than I ever did in any traditional canvassing because of just the amount of doors that I was knocking on. And the conversations absolutely were not, quick ID questions, but they were real discussions. On one block alone, I talked with a man who told me that he was a diehard Republican and he always voted Republican. And then right after that, like 2 doors down, I had an amazing conversation for about 15, 20 minutes with an Indian immigrant voter who was completely appalled by Republican immigration policies. And what was so surprising to me is that I was finding myself agreeing with the Republican voter on a lot more than what I expected, right? And I think he was surprised to have this Democratic volunteer, me, on his doorstep, who really genuinely wanted to find common ground with him. We were both concerned about the economy. We were both concerned about the safety of our communities. And we were definitely both concerned with increasing political polarization. And honestly, I think that's why it's called Ground Truth, because I wasn't just hearing from the same slice of voters over and over. And I walked away with a much clearer picture of what people, just everybody, are actually talking about when politics is not filtered through our own little individual bubbles. I know that it was an impactful thing to do for our democracy, but it was also really personally fulfilling to expand my perspectives and to find common ground with everyone that I spoke with.
Whether we like it or not, we are truly in a war for democratic freedom right now. And it seems the battle line is defined by the illusion that we are hopelessly lost in political divides. From where I sit, it appears that a critical act of resistance is defined by the willingness to burst out of our bubbles and listen. Our next canvasser, named Zach, was part of a college group that canvassed in upstate New York, and his story shows how authenticity is an attractor for young voters.
With your college Dems group, did you find that voters were receptive to you, even though most of you have only voted once in your lives?
Yeah, 100%. I think people are also excited that they have college students on their doorstep on a Saturday morning instead of sleeping in or studying or doing something else. So I think that's definitely always in our favor. But also because the ground truth canvases are not very transactional, they're based off of listening, really talking about the issues that matter to voters. And I think the combination of those two factors, both that we're young and engaged in politics, but also that we're there trying to have a real conversation, definitely made a lot of people receptive to what we were saying and eager to engage in longer conversations. A lot of people we talked to were pretty conservative. Some people who even voted for Donald Trump. But even when we had all these different political views, I think everyone is still affected by those same core issues. You know, a lot of frustration with the MAGA majorities in Congress, a lot of frustration with the economic situation. And by listening and having these conversations, we were able to, come to common ground, come to the same conclusions on a lot of issues, and even change people's minds. I'd also say that we were able to successfully recruit even more volunteers for our canvases because we were able to say, hey, we're going to be listening, we're going to be talking to people, we're not going to be transactional. And that encouraged a lot of students who might have not been wanting to come on our canvases to join Ground Truth and talk to people in a real way.
With all these long, authentic conversations, I wondered how Ground Truth would actually be able to harvest and direct this nuanced information they had learned from these voters. Not surprisingly, high tech has an outsized role to play in transforming conversations into leverageable data. Here's Yasmin Radjy.
If you have a long, robust conversation with the nuances and layers and idiosyncrasies of real human conversation, it is impossible to distill all of that into a checked box of this conversation was about affordability or about climate or whatever. And so what does that mean? Is that when a volunteer typically goes and has one of those conversations, they write in the margins of their walk sheet or in the note section of their minivan app, all of the color between the lines of this person lost their job, they're really freaked out. They're a veteran and they're worried about their benefits getting cut because of the administration. Someone should follow up with them, right? What we now have the ability to do because of AI is what a volunteer does when they walk away from the door is they hit record on their canvassing app. They repeat back everything that they just talked about. They're writing handwritten notes so that they don't forget key quotes or, individual numbers of what that person might have said. But they're repeating back. The guidance we give is much like a doctor would a patient visit. So non-judgmentally include those details so that, a doctor needs to be able to make the right diagnosis. A volunteer needs to really help the campaigns make the right diagnosis of what people are caring about. And all of that becomes messy voice to text paragraphs that normally would just die in a database. Nobody would do anything about it. You're seeing the things that people are talking about. And so one example of the power of how AI, with an asterisk of human check, making sure that AI can hallucinate and whatever. So we've got to have some good oversight over not letting AI just sort of go rogue. But what we saw through our AI analysis of those 25 canvases across 14 congressional districts was that the top issue that we assumed would come up was affordability. In fact, the top issue across Republicans, independents, and Democrats was not affordability. It was this feeling like the system is broken, both parties suck, and that nobody cares about me as a voter, as a member of this community, as whatever the case may be. And that is something that, number one, of course that relates to affordability. That also relates to every issue under the sun. It is a totally different frame. And our old ways of campaigning, that was not a box to check. So those insights from our volunteers would be completely lost because, well, is that affordability or is that immigration? How do we fit that in based on these conversations? And so we share that back with campaigns, and that looks and feels different with different texture in Pennsylvania's 8th district up in the Poconos Mountains compared to, California's 13th district in the California Central Valley. And that's something else that so much of the way that the sort of like texture of conversations gets to campaigns is through national focus groups or national research. The system being broken, sure, that's a national trend, but it looks really different in different parts of the country. And we can now provide that insight in really specific ways with people in a way that would just take too much human power to do without assistance from AI as our data aggregating friend that couples those human conversations.
Yasmin, I can see how powerful all of this can be. And as I look ahead to the elections, if we weren't in the middle of an authoritarian power grab, I would be 100% excited about the coming midterms, given the ways that we can involve ourselves through efforts like Ground Truth. But I do have to ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you think we'll have a reasonably free and fair election?
You know, at the beginning of the post-election, post-2024 period, one of the questions I was getting incredibly frequently, like probably daily, was, who cares about the midterms? We're probably not even going to have the midterms, right? What do you think? Like, do you think they're actually going to happen? And at the beginning, I was just like, okay, we need to take a deep breath. You know, this is America. I think that the pace with which this administration has, in less than a year, implemented the most extreme aspects of Project 2025 already, and has done so with impunity. And they have already taken very clear steps to demonstrate that voter intimidation and election interference is on the table for them, right? Like in the 2025 elections, sending intimidating poll observers to parts of California that happen to overlap perfectly with the House map for 2026. I mean, I just think at this point, it feels naive to think that there will not be any funny business, to put it the mildest way possible, moving forward. We are no longer flirting with authoritarian leanings. All of the ingredients of authoritarian rule are being added to the pot in rapid pace. So I say that to say, I don't think for any listeners that you have that feel like it is paranoid to be worried about this stuff, I really don't think it is. We're paying attention. And I think that's really important to hold on to, because we are in a very serious moment that we have not experienced this type of a serious moment in American history. We've also experienced horrific other moments, but this is different than what we've experienced. So I say that, and I think the risk of spending all of our time thinking about that is that feels so impossible to poke at. Like, how the hell do you stop an authoritarian from meddling in elections and acting violently? Returning to sort of like, what are the things that we can control? I try to spend as much of my day thinking about, within the realm of things that we can control, are we doing as much as we possibly can? We have only so many competitive House races, just because of the nature of how the lines are drawn with a big asterisk. I know the lines are getting redrawn all over the place, in good ways in California and bad ways elsewhere. It's changing all the time. Even with wherever the redistricting wars land, there are only so many competitive congressional districts. They are structured in a way that they are going to be really close. And so in the realm of things that we can control, we have to be set up to win as full-throatedly as possible in as many of those places as possible. And I think if the entire control of the House comes down to a competitive congressional district in a red-controlled state by just a couple hundred votes, I have no doubt in my mind Trump is going to do whatever he can to meddle. If we are winning by a 20-seat majority and we're winning full-throatedly in those, logistically, Trump can try what he wants, but he's not going to be able to mess with the midterms. So we've got to win full-throatedly. My anchor anxiety about 2025 is I'm hearing a lot of, we don't need to worry about the midterms. The midterms are all set. We did so well in 2025. Democrats are back, baby. We're good. I think that is a really scary way to think, because it then strips us of the feeling of urgency of, we've got to do everything that we can to win the midterms full-throatedly. So that is my overall reflection for the midterms. I also think the midterms are going to be essential for both the outcome and the process by which we get to a Democratic win. Will be essential for setting the stage for what will be possible for Trump's funny business leading up to the 2028 election. And that is a whole other can of worms, but we are already in the 2028 presidential elections. The midterms are like, what is the chessboard that we want to have as we begin that 2028 game? And I would much rather enter 2028, get into the sort of like wildness of the primaries happening in 2027 with a full-throated House majority, control over the oversight committee, and election systems that we have already shown work, rather than the inverse.
So Yasmin, we're coming to the end of our time together. Are there any closing thoughts?
I just hope that any listener who is feeling total paralysis and is not sure how they can contribute, I hear a lot from our best leaders in the country that they never self-identified as a leader. And so that was a big barrier to them signing up. So I hope anyone who feels anything like that will sign up to join our efforts. And I also hope that any person who has taken action, either a little bit of action or a lot of action, maybe they're a really seasoned activist, will also join us, because we really need people of all types, people with different gifts, people with different bandwidth, to come and join Ground Truth to build a new way of engaging with voters, new infrastructure that will support the existing infrastructure, both where it's really strong and also where there's room for improvement. So I hope they'll go to swingleft.org or go to ourgroundtruth.org and get involved. We will be out in every competitive congressional district, which folks can also see on our website. So we hope they'll join us.
Ground Truth's canvassing campaign ahead of this year's primary has officially begun, and it will be continuing throughout the year leading up to the midterms. They are inviting you to join them, and this is your chance to be a part of sowing connection in order to reweave the American political fabric and swing power back towards the people. I'm Christine Barrington, and this has been the Apocalyptic Supper Club, nourishment for dire times. For more resources to pump up your inner hero, visit apocalypticsupperclub.com, where you will find articles, links, this podcast, as well as previous podcasts, to inspire you to know that you matter. Check it out and put something tasty on your political plate for a change.